foundations in dust. The autumn rain tapped against the windows of the small apartment as Josephine Mercer folded the rejection letter and tucked it into her pocket. Another publisher had passed on her manuscript. She glanced at the clock, almost time to pick up Dominic from kindergarten. The rejection could wait. Her son couldn't. Josephine pulled her worn raincoat over her waitress uniform and grabbed her umbrella. The diner had let her leave early today, but that meant fewer tips. Every dollar mattered when raising a child alone in Riverstone, a forgettable town on the outskirts of Pittsburgh. As she walked the 4 blocks to Dominic's school, her mind drifted to Thomas Reed, as it often did on rainy days. They had met at university, she studying literature, he pursuing photography. Thomas had been magnetic, with dreams that seemed to pull the stars from the sky. When Josephine discovered she was pregnant in their final year, Thomas had seemed excited, even proposing with a simple silver band. But as her pregnancy progressed, Thomas grew distant. His photography was gaining recognition, and opportunities beckoned from New York and beyond. 3 months after Dominic was born, Thomas packed his cameras. "This isn't the life I planned, Joe," he'd said, not meeting her eyes. "I can't be the father he needs while chasing my career. It's better this way." He'd left a check that barely covered 2 months' rent, and then vanished from their lives. Josephine reached the school just as children began spilling out. Dominic spotted her immediately, his serious little face brightening. At 5 years old, he already carried himself with a peculiar gravity, like someone who understood more than his years should allow. "Mom, I made something for you," he announced, pulling a folded paper from his backpack. It was covered in numbers and crude drawings of what appeared to be planets. "Ms. Winters says I'm good at numbers," he explained as they walked home, sheltered under the umbrella. "She gave me special problems today." Josephine smiled, though worry creased her brow. Dominic had always been exceptional, walking early, speaking in full sentences by 18 months, reading before preschool. His kindergarten teacher had already suggested testing for advanced placement. At home, while Dominic worked on more calculations at the kitchen table, Josephine prepared a simple dinner of pasta with vegetables. Their apartment was small but clean, with second-hand furniture Josephine had carefully selected for durability rather than style. Bookshelves lined one wall, mostly library discards and yard sale finds, but they were filled with science and mathematics texts alongside children's stories. "Mom, did you know Jupiter has 79 moons?" Dominic asked without looking up from his paper. "I didn't," she replied, hiding her surprise. "Where did you learn that?" "Library book," he said simply. Josephine made weekly trips to the public library with him, where he gravitated toward the science section rather than children's books. After dinner, during their bedtime routine, Dominic asked the question he occasionally returned to. "Do you think my dad would like that I'm good at math?" Josephine's heart constricted. She never spoke ill of Thomas, believing Dominic deserved to form his own opinions someday. "I think anyone would be proud of how smart and kind you are," she answered carefully. Later, after Dominic had fallen asleep in their shared bedroom, Josephine sat at the kitchen table with her writing notebook and a cup of tea. She'd once dreamed of being a novelist, but those ambitions had taken a back seat to motherhood and survival. Still, she wrote when she could, creating worlds where people found their way back to what mattered. Tomorrow would bring another shift at the diner, another at the bookstore, and an evening helping Dominic with his increasingly advanced interests. Josephine was exhausted, but watching her son's mind unfold was worth every sacrifice. She looked at the faded photograph tucked in her notebook, her and Thomas in happier days, and wondered if he ever thought about the brilliant little boy growing up without him. Seeds of brilliance. The winter sun cast long shadows across Principal Hargrove's office as Josephine listened to words that would alter their trajectory. Dominic, now 8 years old, sat beside her, legs swinging without touching the floor. "Mrs. Mercer, your son's test results are unprecedented," Principal Hargrove said, sliding a folder across her desk. "Dominic's aptitude for mathematics and physics places him at a high school level, possibly beyond." Josephine wasn't surprised. For 3 years, she'd watched Dominic devour books on quantum mechanics and celestial mathematics, while other children read adventure stories. What did surprise her was the principal's next statement. Westridge Academy has a program for exceptional students. They're offering Dominic a full scholarship. Westridge was a prestigious private school 50 miles away. A scholarship would cover tuition, but not transportation or the supplies required for advanced studies. Josephine calculated quickly. It would mean another job, less sleep, fewer hours writing. "Mom, can I go?" Dominic asked quietly, his dark eyes, so like his father's, alight with hope. 3 weeks later, Josephine took on evening work cleaning offices, adding to her diner and bookstore shifts. Their routine transformed. Pre-dawn breakfasts, long commutes, homework at the diner counter during her breaks, falling asleep to the sound of Dominic muttering equations. Professor Eleanor Franklin, head of Westridge's science department, became Dominic's mentor and Josephine's ally. A formidable woman in her 60s with silver hair and penetrating eyes, she recognized not only Dominic's brilliance, but Josephine's determination. "Your son has a mind that appears once in a generation," Eleanor told Josephine during a parent-teacher conference. "But his compassion and work ethic, those come from you." By 12, Dominic was taking university-level courses online. At 14, he was published in a student science journal for his paper on gravitational anomalies. His bedroom wall, once covered with solar system posters, now displayed complex equations and theoretical models. Through it all, Josephine continued writing in stolen moments, between shifts, during Dominic's study sessions, in waiting rooms during academic competitions. Her stories evolved, becoming deeper explorations of perseverance and hidden potential. One evening, after Dominic won a regional science competition with a project on quantum entanglement, Josephine found him staring at his trophy with unexpected melancholy. "What's wrong?" she asked, settling beside him on their worn sofa. "You were brilliant today." "I looked for you in the audience before my presentation," he said. "And I realized I always do that, look for just you. Never for a dad, like the other kids." Josephine's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." Dominic leaned against her shoulder. "You're enough. But sometimes I wonder why I wasn't enough for him to stay." Josephine held her son, now nearly as tall as herself. "His leaving was never about you, Dom. Some people aren't ready for what matters most." That night, after Dominic had fallen asleep amid textbooks and calculation sheets, Josephine allowed herself a rare moment of anger toward Thomas. He'd missed so much. Dominic's first lost tooth, his science fair victories, the way he helped elderly Mrs. Patel with her groceries every Tuesday. Thomas had walked away from a child who had grown into someone extraordinary. What Josephine didn't know was that hundreds of miles away in New York, Thomas Reed was flipping through a photography magazine that featured a small article about promising young scientists. There, in a group photo, stood a lanky teenager with serious eyes that mirrored his own. The caption identified him as Dominic Mercer, quantum theory prodigy. Thomas stared at the image for a long time, recognition and regret blooming simultaneously in his chest. Breakthrough horizons. The campus of Princeton University gleamed under spring sunshine as 19-year-old Dominic Mercer approached the podium. The auditorium was filled with distinguished physicists, journalists, and curious students. In the front row sat Josephine, now 44, her dark hair streaked with silver, wearing the blue dress she'd purchased specifically for this occasion. "Thank you for joining me today," Dominic began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I'm here to present what my research team has termed the Mercer principle of quantum recalibration." Over the next hour, Dominic outlined his revolutionary approach to quantum computing, a theoretical framework that addressed long-standing obstacles in the field. His methodology, developed during his accelerated graduate studies, promised to increase computational power exponentially while reducing energy requirements. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. Questions followed, probing and incisive, which Dominic fielded with the confidence of someone twice his age. Afterwards, He made his way directly to Josephine, embracing her tightly. "They're calling it groundbreaking," he whispered, still processing the reception. "Because it is," she replied simply. That evening, as they celebrated over dinner at a restaurant, nicer than any they'd frequented before, Josephine presented Dominic with a gift, a first edition of a physics text that had inspired him as a child, purchased with money she'd been setting aside for years. "I never doubted you'd reach this moment," she said. The days that followed brought a whirlwind of change. Technology companies sought meetings, research institutions offered funding, prestigious universities extended faculty positions to someone who hadn't yet completed his PhD. A profile in Scientific American called Dominic, the mind that might reshape our technological future. The article mentioned his unusual background. Raised by a single mother who worked multiple jobs to support his education, a modern-day example of exceptional talent rising from ordinary circumstances. More mainstream publications followed. A Sunday feature in the New York Times included photographs of Dominic in his lab and at home with Josephine. The story romanticized their journey, the struggling writer-turned-waitress and her brilliant son succeeding against formidable odds. When the interview requests became overwhelming, Dominic hired Wesley Hammond, a seasoned publicist who specialized in managing scientific personalities. Wesley helped navigate the sudden fame with strategic appearances and carefully controlled narratives. "Your story resonates," Wesley explained during their first meeting. "The public loves the combination of genius and humility, the devoted mother, the triumph over adversity." Dominic accepted this assessment uncomfortably. "The science should speak for itself." "In an ideal world, perhaps," Wesley replied. "But your journey gives people hope. It makes your brilliance accessible." For Josephine, the attention was disorienting. After decades of invisibility, the waitress no one remembered, the cleaning woman no one noticed, she was suddenly featured in magazine spreads about supportive parenting and feminine resilience. A television producer approached her about rights to their story. A publisher expressed interest in her long-abandoned writing, particularly her memoirs. Josephine found these opportunities both vindicating and unsettling. Their financial situation transformed overnight. Dominic's consulting fees and research grants brought security they'd never known. He purchased a comfortable home for Josephine near Princeton, insisting she finally retire from her multiple jobs. "You've worked enough for 10 lifetimes," he told her. "It's my turn now." Josephine accepted reluctantly, struggling to adapt to leisure after decades of constant work. She focused on her writing and volunteered at a literacy program, finding purpose beyond survival for the first time in 20 years. 6 months after the Princeton presentation, during a rare, quiet evening at Josephine's new home, Wesley called with news that sent Dominic into stunned silence. "A man named Thomas Reed contacted my office today," Wesley said. "He claims to be your father and wants to reconnect. Apparently, he's a fairly successful photographer now." After hanging up, Dominic stared at his mother across the kitchen island. "He knows," Dominic said quietly. "After all this time, he finally noticed I exist." Josephine closed her eyes briefly, feeling the past collide with the present. "What do you want to do?" Dominic considered for a long moment. I want to hear what he has to say." Shadows from the past. The restaurant Wesley had selected for the meeting exuded discreet elegance, private booths, subdued lighting, unobtrusive service. Dominic arrived early, dressed in what had become his signature style, tailored blazer over a simple t-shirt, an unconscious blend of academic and accessibility. He'd come alone, despite Josephine's offer to accompany him. "This first conversation should be just you," she'd said, though her eyes betrayed concern. "I've had 20 years to form my opinions about Thomas. You deserve to form yours." When Thomas Reed entered, Dominic recognized him immediately from the handful of photographs Josephine had preserved. At 52, Thomas remained handsome, with silver threading through his dark hair and creases around his eyes that deepened when he smiled uncertainly at his son. "Dominic," he said, his voice catching. "You look like you," Dominic finished neutrally. That's what people always said. They ordered drinks, then navigated awkward small talk about the weather and the restaurant's ambiance. Finally, Thomas placed a leather portfolio on the table. "I brought these," he said, opening it to reveal photographs, dozens of them, spanning decades. "I've followed your life." From a distance. Dominic's expression hardened as he examined the images. Himself at various science competitions, at Westridge Academy's graduation, even walking across Princeton's campus. "All taken with a telephoto lens, all without his knowledge. You were stalking us?" Dominic asked, his voice carrying an edge. "Documenting," Thomas corrected, then sighed. "Though I understand how it seems. I never approached because I didn't think I had the right. But I watched your achievements. I was proud." "Proud," Dominic repeated, the word tasting bitter. "Were you proud when Mom worked 18-hour days to pay for my educational expenses? When she developed chronic back pain from years of standing at the diner? When I won my first science competition and had only one parent cheering?" Thomas flinched. "I made a terrible mistake leaving you both. I was young, selfish, terrified of responsibility. By the time I realized what I'd thrown away, years had passed. I thought it would be cruel to disrupt your lives." "Convenient reasoning," Dominic observed coldly. "Fair assessment," Thomas conceded. "I don't expect forgiveness. But seeing you in the news, hearing about your breakthrough, I couldn't stay away any longer." Thomas explained that his photography career had indeed flourished. He'd traveled extensively, documenting humanitarian crises and environmental issues. His work had won awards and granted him financial success, but personal relationships had remained transient, with no family of his own. "I've spent 20 years capturing other people's most significant moments," Thomas said, "while missing all of yours." Despite his resolve to remain detached, Dominic found himself curious about this man who shared his features and artistic sensibilities, if not his life. "Why now?" Dominic asked directly. "Is it because I'm successful? Because there's something to gain from knowing me now?" Thomas's response was unexpectedly honest. "Partly, yes. Not financially, I've done well enough. But there's a certain validation in being connected to someone extraordinary. It's not noble, but it's true. More than that, though, I'm getting older, facing my regrets, wondering if there's any possibility of redemption." Their conversation extended for hours, moving from tentative questions to more substantive exchanges. Thomas shared stories of his parents, grandparents Dominic had never known, and showed genuine interest in understanding Dominic's research, though much of it exceeded his comprehension. When they finally parted, Thomas asked hesitantly, "Would it be possible to meet with your mother as well?" Dominic considered this. "That's entirely her decision. I'll ask, but prepare yourself for refusal." To Dominic's surprise, Josephine agreed to meet Thomas, though she requested Dominic's presence as a buffer. The reunion occurred at her home the following weekend, neutral territory that nonetheless represented the stability she'd created without Thomas. "You look wonderful." "Joe," Thomas said when she opened the door. Josephine's expression remained impassive. "What do you want from us, Thomas? After all this time?" Her directness hung in the air between them, demanding truth after decades of absence. The weight of truth. The living room of Josephine's home felt simultaneously too large and too confining as the three of them settled into an uneasy triangle, Josephine and Dominic on the sofa, Thomas in an armchair opposite them. Through the window, afternoon sunlight illuminated dust motes dancing in the still air. "I want a chance," Thomas finally answered Josephine's blunt question. "To know my son. To make amends, if possible." Josephine studied the man she'd once loved, noting the unfamiliar creases around his eyes, the confident posture that had replaced youthful restlessness. "You had 20 years of chances, Thomas." "I know." He leaned forward, hands clasped. "I've spent months trying to formulate the perfect explanation, but there isn't one. I was a coward. I convinced myself you were better off without me." "We were," Josephine stated without malice. But that doesn't mean your absence didn't leave scars. Thomas nodded, accepting this truth. I've brought something. He reached for a large envelope he'd placed beside his chair. Not photographs this time. Inside was a stack of documents, legal papers transferring a significant portion of his assets into a foundation named after Dominic, dedicated to supporting single parents with academically gifted children. I can't undo the past, Thomas explained, but perhaps this might help others facing similar circumstances. Dominic examined the paperwork, his scientific mind automatically calculating figures. The endowment was substantial, millions accumulated through Thomas's successful career, enough to fund scholarships, transportation assistance, and supplementary programs for dozens of families annually. Money doesn't erase abandonment, Dominic said quietly. No, it doesn't, Thomas agreed. This isn't about buying forgiveness. It's about acknowledging that what Josephine did alone was extraordinary and should be easier for others. Josephine, who had maintained her composure throughout, suddenly stood and walked to the bookshelf. She returned with a weathered journal. I've been writing all these years, she said, handing it to Thomas. This volume covers ages 5 through 8. Dominic's early fascination with astronomy, his first advanced mathematics class, the night he had pneumonia and I couldn't afford to miss work. So I brought him to the diner wrapped in blankets. Thomas opened the journal with trembling hands, confronted with intimate details of the years he'd missed, rendered in Josephine's eloquent prose. There are 14 more volumes, she continued. You're welcome to read them all. Not as punishment, but as education. If you truly want to know your son, start by understanding what shaped him. The conversation that followed lasted well into evening, painful recollections interspersed with cautious questions. Thomas learned about Dominic's childhood asthma, his brief but intense interest in entomology, his struggle with insomnia during adolescence. Josephine and Dominic heard about Thomas's experiences documenting refugee crises, his 3-month hospitalization after contracting malaria in Sudan, his retrospective exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. They were 3 adults finding connections while acknowledging the chasm between them could never fully close. As twilight deepened, Dominic asked Thomas directly, "What exactly are you hoping for here? A relationship? Public acknowledgement?" Thomas considered before answering. "I'd like whatever you're willing to give. I understand it might be nothing beyond today, and I'd accept that. If it's more, occasional conversations, gradual acquaintance, I'd be grateful. As for public acknowledgement, that's entirely your decision. I won't leverage our connection for publicity," Dominic nodded, appreciating the honesty if not yet ready to offer forgiveness. 2 months later, Dominic stood at another podium, this time announcing the Mercer Family Foundation for Educational Access. Beside him stood Josephine, elegant in emerald green. Several rows back sat Thomas, present but not presuming intimacy. "This foundation honors the journey that brought me here," Dominic explained to the assembled press. "It recognizes that exceptional minds exist in all circumstances, and that with proper support, potential need not be limited by resources." He didn't publicly acknowledge Thomas that day, but he did reference him obliquely. We learn as much from absence as from presence, from struggle as from ease. Every path contains wisdom if we're brave enough to recognize it. The foundation became a focal point for their tentative relationship, a neutral territory where Thomas's expertise in visual, storytelling, and international connections complemented Josephine's intimate understanding of the challenges facing single-parent scholars. Dominic provided direction and vision, translating his own experience into systemic support. One evening, a year after Thomas's reappearance, Dominic found Josephine in her garden, tending to tomato plants with the same careful attention she'd once given to his science projects. "Do you regret letting him back into our lives?" Dominic asked, settling beside her on the stone bench. Josephine considered the question seriously. "No, not for myself. I made peace with Thomas's choices long ago. I worried for you, that disappointment might follow hope. But you've handled it with remarkable grace." "I learned resilience from an expert," Dominic smiled, squeezing her hand. "He'll never be what he should have been," Josephine said softly, "but perhaps he can be something of value now." Inside the house, Thomas was preparing dinner, a weekly tradition that had evolved naturally. Their relationship remained complicated, defined by both painful history and deliberate present choices. There were still difficult conversations, moments when old wounds reopened unexpectedly. But there was also growing recognition of shared characteristics. Dominic's artistic perception inherited from Thomas, his determination echoing Josephine's. As they gathered around the table that evening, Dominic observed the parents who had shaped him in such different ways, one through constant presence, the other through conspicuous absence. Both had contributed to the person he had become, a scientist who understood that every reaction leaves trace elements, a man who recognized that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past, but creating space for a different future. "I'm presenting at CERN next month," Dominic mentioned as they ate. "They're implementing the first practical application of my recalibration theory." "We'll both be there," Josephine said, then glanced at Thomas questioningly. Thomas nodded, understanding the significance of the plural pronoun. Not forgiveness exactly, but possibility. "We wouldn't miss it." Outside, stars appeared in the darkening sky, distant bodies whose light traveled across vast emptiness to create patterns recognizable from Earth. Like the constellation of their 3 lives, now cautiously forming new connections while honoring the distance that would always remain.